So, we have been dealing with a heat wave here in the UK, which means that, as always, we come back to the discourse that always happens every time we get a heat wave, which is, hey, are all Europeans just terrible at managing the heat? Why don't they have aircon? Why are they little babies? We handle this just fine in the US, and so on. And in contrast to that, we do have, obviously, the pushback sometimes where people say, no, genuinely, it is much worse here in the UK than you might imagine, than you might think, because in particular here in the UK, when it gets very hot, it's a very humid kind of heat, much more humid than you would see in the US, and therefore it is much worse. It's not just about the lack of the air conditioning. It's not just about people complaining about the heat and all of that. It is, in fact, actually measurably different here. And so as a British person of American extraction, I am, I would say, uniquely qualified to weigh in on this situation. And I will say actually that both sides are right and both sides are wrong. And the reality is somewhere in the middle. And I think that there's just a lot of people playing things up on both sides. So on the side of, is the heat generally worse here? I would say probably not. Like, I've lived in a lot of places, right? So I've lived in multiple places in the US. I have lived in France. I have lived in Denmark. I have lived in the Middle East. Certainly, this is not as bad as it was in the Middle East, I'll say that much. Will I say that it is better or worse than places that I've lived in the US? I would say that in general, one thing that I guess don't really, factor in enough is that really the temperature band for the UK is like so much smaller than what I'm used to in the US. So I'm from Michigan. I've also lived in Ohio. I've lived in Seattle, mostly northern areas that get a decent amount of cold in the winter and still get decently warm in the summer. And I would say that in general, the temperature range is just so much smaller. So in the US, in Michigan at least, where I grew up, it would go from like, hey, it gets super cold in the winter, it gets below freezing, you might get down to, say 20 degrees Fahrenheit or less, and then in the summer, it gets hot, it gets up to 80, 90, 100 degrees, etc. So you have a nice big temperature range there. In the UK, at least around London, the temperature range is like, typical temperature range is like 45 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 40 degrees Fahrenheit, to like 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Like, it's really genuinely, it's actually a quite nice temperature range to live in. It doesn't get super, super cold in the winter. It generally almost never snows. It never freezes. And in the summer, it generally doesn't get too hot. And so as a result, people are used to like, hey, never gets too cold, never gets too hot. Very nice temperature to live in. Obviously, like, the sun doesn't come out all winter and it gets very gray and dreary and wet. And that's, it is what it is. It's a little bit like soul destroying, soul crushing. But it's also actually interestingly, like, I actually looked it up, and where I'm from in Michigan actually gets more precipitation than we do here in London. So it's like, okay, like, it's not even that it's rainier here. It's just that it's genuinely, like, the sun barely comes out for like 4, 5, 6 months out of the year. It's gray all day, and that kind of like weighs on you. Whereas at least in Michigan, it's like, okay, well, yeah, it rains more, but you also get more sun and so on. So yeah, I would say that in general, like, the weather here is pretty mild, honestly. Like, it's really not that bad. People complain about it a lot, but it's pretty fine. Would I say that the heat here is like categorically worse than what I experienced in Michigan? Absolutely not. Like, not in the slightest. It's about the same, maybe a little bit worse, but like not like a huge significant difference. And people always bring up the argument about how, like, yes, like, a big problem that we have here in the UK is that houses are not built for this kind of heat. And that's very, very true. So basically, like, houses, especially here in London, like, are often very, very old. They're like brick. They're like really not even built for like running cables, like electricity through things, much less like actually like, having like central heating or central air or anything like that. And so just almost no place has air conditioning. Like, that's just not a thing. And people talk a lot about how, like, our houses in the UK are, like, built to retain heat. And I would say that that's kind of true, but also kind of not. Like, especially some of the older homes, they're really not built well for anything. Like, they don't really retain heat in the winter, and they don't really stay cool in the summer. So they just kind of suck. Like, they're not good houses. Like, that just is what it is. And that's fine. You know, I lived in one of those houses. You know, great. The house that I live in now is much, much better, retains heat in the winter and so on. But at the same time, the bigger issue is, again, just that we don't have air conditioning. We don't have like a way to manage our temperature indoors. And so what ends up happening is that like heat just builds up over the day. And then because we don't really have any way to dissipate that, aside from just like, you know, maybe cracking the windows a bit, and you probably don't want to do that at night because then you get bugs coming in. It kind of happens like, you know, even though, you know, like the heat, you know, dissipates, it's no longer the middle of the day, you know, the sun goes down, it's still hot through the night. Like you're still sleeping sweaty, you're still sleeping, you know, just like feeling gross and muggy and all of that. And that is a little bit worse. Like that is worse because obviously, again, like you don't have aircon. And the next big issue is just like the lack of aircon itself. Like obviously, in general, houses are not built to have central aircon. That's not a thing. You can have like an air conditioning unit, but you're typically not going to have the kinds that you see in American homes because you don't have the kinds of windows that you see in American homes. Obviously, windows in American homes tend to, you know, do the upwards opening thing, and that makes it very easy to get like a nice, you know, rectangular aircon unit that you can put in there and run that, and that's great. You don't tend to have the same kinds of things. You tend to have to be like, okay, well, I'm going to get a standing unit that has a big hose, and I'm going to run that out a window and all of that, and that's a lot less convenient and a lot less manageable. And also just the reality is that like a lot of people just can't afford to run aircon blasting 24/7 here in the UK. And so they just don't. That is what it is. And so in general, what a lot of people will do is basically just, you know, hunker down, get a desk fan, you know, like whatever, and just, you know, try and survive. Crack open every window they can, try and survive. And so it is worse in that sense because I would say primarily we just don't have the same level of tools to deal with it. At the same time, I will say that one thing that's really overlooked in the debate a lot is basically just like how American lifestyles are way more car-centric and they are way more aircon-centric in a way that is like you are basically moving in a perfect bubble of air at all times. So your average American, you have a lovely house that has central aircon. You can run it all the time. It's great, you know, keeping your temperature down. So you have a nice, you know, temperature in your house. And then you leave your house, you get in your car, in your garage, turn on your air conditioning in your car. So great, you're still protected there. And then you go outside and you drive to, you know, your work or the store or whatever. And of course, the store has air conditioning. Your work has air conditioning. Everywhere has air conditioning. So you never actually have to like do anything outside for the most part. You basically just move from like one bubble of air conditioning to the next, and you never really have to, you know, do any of that. Here in the UK, that's not the case. Businesses may have air conditioning, central air conditioning, but often will not. And houses most often don't. And yes, like you may use a car to travel from point A to point B. That may be the case. But more often, that's not going to be the case. More often, you're going to be using public transit. Public transit may or may not have air conditioning. And in particular, I saw a tweet the other day about how, like, you know, basically it's like really, really bad on the underground. Like, anytime you get on the tube in the summer, like it stinks, it smells, it's very, very hot down there. And I saw a post the other day about how someone was like, yeah, you know, fun fact is that technically in the summer, the temperatures on the underground basically like exceed the like humane temperatures for transportation of livestock or whatever. It's hot and it's stinky and it's smelly down there, like it is, especially in the summer. You know, you're going from hot to hot to hot. Like instead of, you know, Americans where you're going from air conditioning to air conditioning to air conditioning, you're going from like hot to hot to hot, or like maybe hot to, if you drive, a bit of air conditioning back to hot, or maybe like hot air conditioning or whatever. Like you get a little bit of air conditioning here and there, but it's not like a constant the way it is for Americans. And so to a certain extent, like, like are, like Europeans just like complaining? Well, like, yeah, to a certain extent, it isn't that much worse than the US. But also at the same time, are Europeans right that, like, the issue is just that, like, we've not built air conditioning? Like, it doesn't really fit into our houses. It doesn't really work the same way. Like, yeah, that's also true, too. So, like, both sides are kind of right. Like, I think to a certain extent, like, yes, like, sometimes Europeans are just kind of a little bit whiny about it. But also at the same time, like, yes, like, it's a real issue. Like, the architecture of the buildings, of the houses, is not something that you can change overnight. Like, the fact that I used to live in a house that predated World War II, and, like, because of that, you couldn't, like, retrofit air conditioning into that in a good way, was like, well, yeah, like, if you tore down that house tomorrow and you built a new one and you put air conditioning in it, then, like, yeah, that would be lovely. But you can't do that. You can't just tear down everybody's houses and build new ones. Like, a huge part of the issue in this country is we're not building enough housing as is. And so, like, like, can we just expect that, like, overnight building standards are going to change? Everyone's going to immediately be like, all right, climate change is here. Let's actually start building air conditioning. Like, no, that's not going to happen either. So it really is something that will take a long time to really change. And it's not something that can change overnight. And, like, in the meantime, people are going to suffer. Like, every time there's a heat wave, a bunch of people die because, like, just like, people are not used to this kind of temperature. Again, like, the temperature range for the UK is actually not that bad, not that big. So we're just not used to such a huge temperature range. This heat wave is like 20 degrees hotter than, like, it normally is this time of year, which is crazy. 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees freedom units, not Celsius. I still haven't actually learn Celsius. I've got kilogram brain now, but I do not have a Celsius brain, unfortunately. But yeah, like, at the end of the day, like, people die. Like, people are not prepared for it. People do not have the tools, the means, the ability to anticipate this or to work around this, and people die every time we have a major heat wave, and that is what it is. It's not like something that can be solved by, like, Americans being like, oh, European suck, or Europeans being like, no, we don't actually, we're fine. Like, the reality is that, like, the heat here is not necessarily worse than it is in the US, but people are not prepared for it. This country is not built, architecture that is used to it or that anticipates it. And, it's just like, that needs to change. Like, that is, the situation at the end of the day. So, I don't know. I mean, I think both sides are wrong. Both sides are right. But, like, again, the reality is at the end of the day that stuff does need to change. And hopefully people will start to change. Hopefully this will actually encourage people to change and encourage people to build differently and encourage people to live differently. But we'll see. Who knows? Anyway, that's all for today's video. As always, don't hesitate to like, comment, subscribe, smash the notification bell down below. Direct any hate mail down there. I guess tell me that I'm too American for this debate or too European for this debate or something. Make fun of me for thinking in Fahrenheit. I don't know. Whatever. Anyway, have a good week. I'll see you all next time.